The old cowboy heard someone crying inside his barn. Long after midnight, when he opened the lantern light, a terrified woman was hiding in the hay. She looked at him and whispered, "Please, don't let them find me." What Samuel discovered next would shake the entire valley. The wind howled across the prairie like a restless ghost, dust rolled through the valley in thick waves as night swallowed the last glow of sunset. Miles away from the nearest town, the old Morgan ranch stood quiet beneath the rising moon. Inside the barn, horses shifted lazily in their stalls. Then suddenly, one of them panicked, hooves slammed against wood, the lantern hanging near the door swayed gently. Samuel Morgan looked up from the saddle he was repairing. At 65, the old cowboy had lived through more winters than most men in that county. His hands were rough, his beard gray, and his back bent slightly from decades in the saddle, but his hearing was still sharp, and that sound wasn't normal. He stood slowly. Another noise came from the far corner of the barn. A soft sob. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the revolver resting on a nearby crate. "Who's there?" he called calmly. No answer. Only the trembling breath of someone trying desperately not to cry. Samuel grabbed the lantern and walked between the stalls. The horses were restless, and then he saw her. A young woman crouched behind a stack of hay bales. Her dress was torn, mud covered her boots, her hands shook as if she'd been running for miles, and her eyes looked like they had seen something terrible. When the lantern light touched her face, she flinched. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking. "Don't send me away." Samuel studied her for a long moment. She looked exhausted, terrified, not dangerous. He slowly lowered the lantern, then he spoke quietly, "You're safe now." The words seemed to break whatever strength she had left. The woman collapsed against the hay, crying harder than before. Samuel didn't ask questions yet. He simply pulled an old wool blanket from the wall and placed it over her shoulders. Outside, the wind continued to roar across the prairie, but inside the barn, something else had begun. A story neither of them could yet understand. The woman didn't speak for nearly an hour. Samuel sat nearby on an overturned bucket, pretending to polish his saddle while giving her space. Eventually, her breathing slowed. "My name is Clara," she said quietly. Samuel nodded once. "Samuel Morgan." She hesitated. "You live here alone?" "Been that way for a long time." Another silence passed, then Samuel noticed something strange. Clara kept glancing toward the barn door, like she expected someone to burst through it. "Someone chasing you?" he asked calmly. Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead she asked something unexpected. "You ever hear of the town of Red Hollow?" Samuel's jaw tightened slightly. Of course he had. Red Hollow was 20 miles east, and lately, nothing good ever came out of that place. "Depends what you're asking," he said. Clara looked down at the dirt floor. "My father runs the bank there." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "The Carson Bank?" She nodded slowly, but there was no pride in her voice, only fear. Samuel had heard rumors about that bank, land taken from struggling farmers, debts that seemed impossible to repay, families disappearing overnight, and behind it all, a man named Edward Carson. "Clara's father, what happened?" Samuel asked quietly. Clara's voice trembled. "He's not the man people think he is." Clara reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. Samuel opened it. His eyes narrowed. It wasn't just a bank document. It was a list, dozens of names, farmers, ranchers, widows, every one of them marked with the same note. "Property transferred." Samuel recognized several names, men who had vanished months ago. "This came from your father's desk?" he asked. Clara nodded slowly. "But that's not the worst part." Samuel waited. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "I also heard him talking." "To who?" "A man named Wade Mercer." Samuel's eyes darkened. "Mercer, the most feared outlaw in 3 counties." If those two were working together, then Red Hollow had a bigger problem than anyone realized. What were they planning? Samuel asked. Clara looked toward the barn door again. "They're forcing people to sell their land." "How?" "Threats. Violence. And if someone refuses," her voice cracked, "they disappear." Samuel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Land theft, extortion, murder, all hidden behind the respectability of a banker. "Why tell me?" Samuel asked quietly. Clara met his eyes. "Because they know I heard them." Samuel understood instantly. "You ran." She nodded. "They'll come looking." And right on cue, a distant sound echoed across the prairie. Horse hooves, more than one. Samuel stood slowly. "How many know you left?" Clara's face turned pale. 3 men. Samuel walked to the barn door and blew out the lantern. Darkness filled the barn. Outside, the riders were getting closer. The men eventually rode away. Clara exhaled shakily. "They'll come back." Samuel nodded. "Probably." She looked at him. "Then what?" Samuel walked to the workbench. From a drawer he pulled out an old leather satchel. Inside were papers, maps, letters. Clara frowned. What is all that? Samuel gave a small, tired smile. Evidence. Clara's eyes widened. You already knew. Samuel nodded slowly. Been collecting proof for months. Proof of what? That your father and Wade Mercer are stealing half the valley. Samuel then revealed something even more painful. My brother was one of the men on that list. Clara sat silently for a long moment, then she said something Samuel didn't expect. I want to help. Samuel looked surprised. That's your father. I know, she whispered, but if he's hurting people, someone has to stop him. Samuel closed the satchel. We ride at dawn. But neither of them realized something terrifying. Someone had been hiding in the barn loft, listening to every word. The man slipped quietly out the back window, mounted his horse, and rode straight toward Red Hollow. Morning came cold and gray. Samuel and Clara rode toward town. They stopped at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dalton studied the evidence carefully, then he locked the door. You two are in serious danger, he said, but I believe you. Dalton grabbed his rifle. Tonight we expose them. That night the entire town gathered in the square. Clara revealed the truth. Samuel presented the evidence. Farmers shouted, families demanded answers. The town turned against Edward Carson. The town square of Red Hollow had never felt so tense. Lanterns flickered along the wooden storefronts, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The air carried the low murmur of angry voices as farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk gathered shoulder to shoulder. They had heard Clara speak, they had seen the list, and now the truth sat heavy in the center of town like a storm waiting to break. Edward Carson stood on the porch of the bank, his face pale but still stubborn with pride. His expensive coat and polished boots looked strangely out of place among the dusty, furious crowd. Sheriff Dalton stood beside Samuel Morgan near the center of the square, rifle resting against his shoulder. People deserve answers, Dalton announced loudly. The murmuring grew louder. A farmer near the front raised his voice. You took my land, Carson. Another man shouted. My brother vanished after he refused your deal. Clara stood beside Samuel, her hands trembling but her voice steady when she spoke again. My father worked with Wade Mercer, she said. They forced people to sign their land away. And if they refused? Mercer's men made sure they disappeared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Carson finally stepped forward. That's a lie, he snapped. This girl is confused. She's been manipulated. Samuel said nothing. Instead, he simply held up the folded document, the list. Dalton read several names aloud. Every name brought another angry shout from the crowd. Carson's composure began to crack. You have no proof those people were harmed, he argued desperately. But just as the crowd surged closer, a sudden noise cut through the square. Horse hooves, fast, heads turned toward the edge of town. A rider burst into view, pushing his horse hard through the street, even before the lantern light revealed his face. Samuel knew who it was, Wade Mercer. The outlaw's long coat flapped behind him as he pulled the horse to a stop near the saloon. For a moment, the entire town fell silent. Mercer slowly scanned the crowd. His cold eyes settled on Clara, then on Samuel. Well, Mercer said with a crooked smile, looks like you stirred up quite a gathering. Sheriff Dalton lifted his rifle. Get off that horse, Mercer. Mercer laughed softly. I don't take orders from small-town sheriffs. The tension snapped tight like a pulled rope. Samuel stepped forward. You're done, Mercer. Mercer tilted his head slightly. You must be Morgan. Samuel didn't answer, but Mercer's eyes darkened with recognition. I remember your brother, the outlaw said casually. Stubborn man. The words hit Samuel like a punch. The crowd sensed the danger immediately. Several people backed away. Mercer slowly swung down from his horse, boots landing in the dust. His hand hovered near his revolver. You really think this town's going to stand against me? Mercer said quietly. Dalton spoke firmly. They already have. Mercer smirked. We'll see. The square went silent again. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Samuel took one slow step forward. You killed men who refused to give up their land, he said. Mercer shrugged. Business. Samuel's eyes hardened. My brother wasn't business. Mercer gave a small grin. No, he was a problem. The insult hung in the air like gunpowder. Everyone knew what was coming next. Mercer's fingers twitched near his holster. Samuel's hand rested calmly at his side. Clara held her breath. Sheriff Dalton whispered under his breath, don't do it, Mercer. But the outlaw had already made his choice. In one sudden motion, Mercer reached for his gun. The sound of two revolvers clearing leather split the silence, but only one shot echoed across Red Hollow. Samuel's gun fired first, the crack of the shot rang off the buildings like thunder. Mercer staggered, his revolver slipped from his hand. For a moment he stood there, shock frozen on his face, then he collapsed into the dust. Silence fell over the town square. No one moved. The outlaw who had terrorized the valley for years lay motionless in the dirt. Sheriff Dalton slowly lowered his rifle. Well, he muttered, that settles that. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time the fear was gone. Clara looked at Samuel, her eyes wide. Samuel quietly reholstered his revolver. The wind finally returned, sweeping dust gently through the street. Edward Carson watched from the bank porch, his face drained of color. The power he once held over the valley had vanished in a single moment. Dalton stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Carson's shoulder. I think you and I need to have a long conversation, the sheriff said, and for the first time since the night began, justice had finally come to Red Hollow. The prairie looked different when justice had finally settled. Weeks had passed since the night Red Hollow changed forever. Spring had begun to touch the valley. The harsh winter winds had softened, and fresh grass pushed through the dusty earth where cattle once struggled to graze. The sky stretched wide and blue above the land, the same way it always had, but somehow it felt quieter now. Peaceful. At the Morgan Ranch, morning sunlight spilled across the wooden fence and the old barn where everything had begun. Samuel Morgan stood near the corral, slowly repairing a broken fence rail. His movements were steady and patient, the same way they had been for most of his life. For decades, this ranch had been a lonely place, but lately, it didn't feel so empty anymore. Across the yard, a horse approached along the long dirt road that wound through the prairie. Samuel noticed the rider immediately. He leaned on the fence post and watched quietly as the horse drew closer. The rider wore a simple brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her face from the sun, but Samuel already knew who it was. Clara Carson slowed the horse near the gate and stepped down carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly through the grass. Clara looked different than the night she first arrived at the ranch. Back then she had been frightened, exhausted, and running from a world that suddenly felt dangerous. Now there was strength in her eyes, the kind that comes after someone survives something difficult. Samuel walked toward the gate. Thought you might come back, he said calmly. Clara smiled faintly. I wasn't sure if I should. Samuel pushed the gate open for her. Well, he replied, you made it this far. Clara stepped inside the ranch yard and looked around slowly. The barn, the house, the endless open land stretching toward the horizon. This place feels different during the day, she said quietly. Samuel chuckled softly. It's a lot less scary without people chasing you. Clara laughed for the first time in days. It felt strange, but good. They walked toward the barn together. For a moment Clara stopped near the doorway. Her eyes drifted to the same corner where she had hidden that first night. I remember sitting right there, she said. Samuel nodded. You look like you've been through a war. In some ways. I had. Silence settled gently between them, not the awkward kind, the peaceful kind. Clara finally turned toward Samuel. Sheriff Dalton told me the farms are being returned, she said. Samuel nodded. Takes time, but it's happening. Families that had once lost everything were slowly returning to their land. Fields were being replanted, houses repaired, lives rebuilt. Clara lowered her gaze slightly. My father confessed. Samuel didn't look surprised. He knew it was over. Clara's voice was quiet. They'll send him to prison. Samuel rested a hand on the wooden fence. That must be hard. Clara took a slow breath. It is. Then she looked back toward the prairie. But it's also right. The wind moved softly across the open land again. For years that valley had been ruled by fear and silence. Now the truth had finally set it free. Samuel studied Clara for a moment. So, he asked simply, what happens now? Clara hesitated. I'm not sure. You got anywhere to go? She looked down at the dirt road for a moment. Not really. The town of Red Hollow still felt strange to her. The bank, the house she grew up in, all of it carried memories she wasn't ready to return to. Samuel leaned against the fence post again. Well, he said thoughtfully, ranches always need extra hands. Clara raised an eyebrow. You offering me a job, Mr. Morgan? Samuel shrugged. Depends. On what? Whether you can handle early mornings and stubborn horses. Clara smiled. I think I've handled worse. Samuel studied her face carefully. You sure about staying out here? Clara looked across the land once more, the wide prairie, the quiet barn, the peaceful sky stretching endlessly above them. For the first time in weeks, she felt calm. I think I'd like that, she said softly. Samuel nodded once. Good. They stood there for a moment, watching the wind move through the tall grass. Then Samuel spoke again. You know, he said quietly, when I found you in that barn." Clara looked at him. "I remember." Samuel's voice was steady but gentle. "I meant what I said." Clara tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Samuel met her eyes. "You're safe now." But this time the words felt different. That night, they had meant protection, a promise in the middle of fear. Now they meant something more, a chance to start over, a new life on a quiet ranch beneath the endless western sky. Clara smiled softly, and somewhere beyond the hills, the prairie wind carried the dust of the past away, leaving behind only the quiet promise of tomorrow.